The sun bled out across the Appalachian sky, painting the sharp ridges in hues of orange and deep violet. Down in the valley, where the Blackwood River coiled like a sleeping serpent, the light barely pierced the thick canopy of oak and pine. This was a place of deep greens and deeper shadows, a world that hummed with life, but only if you knew how to listen. Samuel Miller knew. At 67, his hands were gnarled like old roots, and his face was a roadmap of creases carved by sun and worry. He'd lived in this small wood-plank cabin his entire life, a stubborn fixture against the slow, grinding passage of time. The river had been his provider, his companion, his adversary. He knew its moods, from the gentle gurgle of summer to the roaring fury of a spring thaw. But tonight something was different. The usual evening choir of cicadas and tree frogs had not begun their performance. The air was still, heavy, holding its breath. Buster, Sam's wiry mutt of indeterminate breed, lay on the worn planks of the porch. His coat was the color of rust and mud, and his ears had a permanent inquisitive fold. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary dog, but his loyalty was as constant as the northern star. Tonight, however, he was not at ease. He lifted his head from his paws, his black nose twitching, sniffing the air with a low, almost inaudible whine. His gaze was fixed on the dense tree line, where the riverbank disappeared into shadow. Sam finished cleaning the last of the day's trout, his movements practiced and economical. He glanced at Buster. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Smell a raccoon? Getting brave?" Buster didn't respond with his usual tail thump. Instead, he rose silently to his feet, the fur along his spine bristling slightly. He took a hesitant step towards the edge of the porch, his body a tense line of inquiry pointed directly at the silent black water. A profound quiet had fallen over the property. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a rural evening. It was a weighted, expectant silence, the kind that comes right before the lightning strikes. Sam felt a prickle of unease on the back of his neck, a primal instinct he hadn't felt in years. He dried his hands on his canvas trousers and walked to the porch rail, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. The cabin was a small fortress of solitude, a simple one-room structure, a woodshed stacked high for the coming winter, and a small, fenced-in chicken coop where his 4 hens were now clucking nervously. Beyond the flimsy barbed wire fence that marked his property line, the ancient forest began. It was a wall of impenetrable green and black, and tonight Sam felt like something was watching from behind that wall. He tried to dismiss it, an old man's nerves perhaps. Living alone for so long could make a man jumpy, probably just a bear wandering down from the ridge, he said aloud, more to convince himself than the dog. But as he spoke, Buster lowered his head and let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very wood of the porch. It was a sound Sam had never heard him make. It was not a sound of warning. It was a sound of dread. Sam stepped back inside and quietly bolted the door, the familiar metallic click doing little to soothe the sudden cold that had settled deep in his bones. The shadow had arrived at Blackwood River. The dead of night was a suffocating blanket. Sam lay in his cot, his eyes wide open, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling. Sleep was a distant country he couldn't reach. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded amplified and sinister. Buster was a silent statue at the foot of the door, not moving, barely breathing, a sentinel on duty. Around 2 in the morning, a sound shattered the quiet. It wasn't loud, but it was violent, a sharp crack of splintering wood, followed by a frantic, squawking panic from the chicken coop. Instantly, Buster was on his feet, a volley of sharp, furious barks erupting from his chest. Sam's heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed the old 12-gauge shotgun he kept propped against the wall, his hands surprisingly steady. He fumbled for the heavy-duty flashlight on the nightstand, its beam cutting a nervous path through the dusty air of the cabin. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his hand on Buster's trembling back. The dog's barking subsided into a continuous low growl, a promise of violence aimed at the unseen intruder. Sam unbolted the door and stepped cautiously onto the porch, the flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. The air was thick with a new scent. It was a heavy, musky odor, a primal smell of wild animal and raw power that overpowered the familiar scent of pine and damp earth. He swept the light across the yard, landing on the chicken coop. The wire mesh on one side was torn open, ripped from the wooden frame with contemptuous ease. 2 of his 4 hens were gone. There were no feathers, no blood, just a gaping hole and the terrified silence of the survivors. His light beam tracked through the damp soil near the coop. There, pressed deep into the mud, was a paw print. It was massive, round, the size of a dinner plate, with no claw marks. The sign was unmistakable. A big cat. Far too big to be a bobcat. A jaguar. He'd heard stories from his grandfather, legends of river phantoms, great spotted cats that roamed these mountains generations ago. Most considered them long gone, ghosts of a wilder time, but the print was fresh, undeniable. As he stared at it, a cold realization washed over him. The creature hadn't just taken the chickens for food. It had been a test, a probe of his defenses. It was still out there. He raised the flashlight beam, sweeping it slowly, methodically, across the dark tree line at the edge of his property. He searched the impenetrable blackness between the trees, his breath held tight in his chest. And then he saw them. For just a fraction of a second, the beam caught 2 points of light, low to the ground, shining with a cold yellow-green fire. They stared back at him from the darkness, unblinking, intelligent. Then, as quickly as they appeared, they vanished. Sam backed away slowly, pulling a stunned Buster with him into the cabin. He slammed the bolt home, his mind racing. This wasn't a random predator. It was watching him, hunting. The vigil had begun, and Sam knew, with the certainty of a man who understands the unforgiving laws of the wild, that he was no longer the master of this small piece of land. He was prey. The sun rose but brought no warmth, no comfort. The daylight felt weak, a temporary truce in a war that had been declared under the cover of darkness. The first thing Sam did was inspect the cabin's exterior. He found them immediately. Long, deep gashes carved into the thick wood of the kitchen door, splinters torn away as if by a giant's razor. The Jaguar had come onto his porch. It had tested the strength of his home while he and Buster stood guard inside. A chilling thought crept into his mind. This wasn't an animal driven purely by hunger. A hungry predator would have been messier, more direct. This felt different, calculated, territorial. He was an intruder in its domain, and it was here to reclaim its territory. The feeling of being a prisoner in his own home solidified. The river, his lifelong friend, now felt like a moat, trapping him on an island with a monster. The forest, his sanctuary, had become a cage. He spent the day in a flurry of nervous activity, a man preparing for a siege. He dragged his heavy workbench in front of the main door. He nailed thick planks of wood over the small kitchen window, sacrificing light for a fraction more security. Every sound from the outside, a falling branch, the cry of a hawk, made him jump. Buster shadowed his every move, a silent, furry extension of Sam's own anxiety. The dog refused to go outside to relieve himself, whining at the door and retreating back to the center of the room. As dusk began to settle again, a new, heavy dread filled the cabin. The first night had been a shock. This second night was a conscious entry into a known terror. Sam sat in his worn armchair, the shotgun laid across his lap, his eyes fixed on the boarded-up window. He didn't bother with a lamp. The darkness felt safer, a cloak to hide behind. And then it appeared, not as a pair of glowing eyes, but as a full silhouette stepping out from the tree line into the moonlit clearing. It moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and horrifying. A long, muscular body, a massive head, a coat of burnished gold covered in a pattern of black rosettes. It was bigger than any jaguar he'd ever seen in pictures. A true phantom of the river. It didn't rush. It didn't sneak. It walked into the center of his yard and stopped, turning its great head to look directly at the cabin. Buster, seeing the creature through a gap in the doorframe, erupted into a frantic, desperate symphony of barks. He threw himself against the door, trying to get out, to meet the challenge. Sam grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the hearth and began banging it against the stone fireplace, the clanging noise a desperate, metallic scream in the night. "Get out of here! Go on, get!" he yelled, his voice cracking. The jaguar remained utterly unimpressed. It watched the cabin, listened to the noise, and then, with a terrifying display of casual power, it laid down in the grass. It tucked its paws beneath its chest, its tail giving a slow, lazy flick. It was not going anywhere. It was waiting, watching. Its patience was a weapon, a psychological tool designed to break him. The message was clear. This is my land. You are here because I allow it, and I will decide when this ends. Sam's blood ran cold. The siege had entered a new, torturous phase. This was a battle of wills, and he felt his own beginning to fray. The stalemate held for hours that felt like lifetimes. The jaguar lay in the yard, a golden statue of impending doom, while inside, Sam and Buster were prisoners of a suffocating tension. Every few minutes, Buster would let out a volley of barks, his body quivering with a mixture of rage and fear. Sam sat motionless, the shotgun growing heavier in his lap, his muscles screaming from the strain of his rigid posture. Sometime after midnight, the jaguar rose. It did not stretch or yawn. It stood with a sudden, deliberate purpose. Sam's heart leapt into his throat. This is it. But instead of charging the door, the great cat began to circle the cabin. It moved with a silent, flowing confidence, a predator mapping every angle of its prey's enclosure. Sam scrambled from window to window, trying to keep it in sight, his socked feet padding silently on the cold wooden floor. He saw its shadow pass the boarded-up kitchen window, then heard its claws make a soft, scratching sound against the back wall. It was testing every inch, looking for a weakness. The end came with an explosion of violence that was faster than Sam could have imagined. With a guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin, the jaguar didn't attack the door or the walls. It launched its immense body directly at the main window. The old glass shattered inward in a shower of glittering shards. The wooden frame splintered and broke, unable to withstand the 150 pounds of focused fury. Before Sam could even raise his shotgun, the phantom was inside his home. The small cabin was thrown into chaos. Buster, with a courage that defied his small stature, did not hesitate. He launched himself at the jaguar, a kamikaze of fur and teeth, snapping at the giant cat's legs and throat, a desperate attempt to give his master a few precious seconds. Sam, stumbling back, finally raised the shotgun. But it was impossible. The two animals were a thrashing, rolling vortex of motion, a blur of gold and black fur and rust and mud. He couldn't get a clear shot without hitting Buster. The air filled with the sound of deep guttural roars and high-pitched yelps of pain, the crash of upended furniture, the scrape of claws on wood. The jaguar was a force of nature. With one swipe of a paw the size of a human hand, it sent Buster flying across the room, where he hit the stone fireplace with a sickening thud. The dog fell to the floor, whimpering, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. The jaguar turned its attention to Sam. Its lips were peeled back in a snarl, revealing enormous, yellowed canines. Its yellow eyes burned with a cold, predatory fire. It gathered its powerful haunches, preparing for a final, lethal leap. In that split second, as death stared him in the face, Sam saw a flash of movement. Buster, dragging his broken body across the floor, summoned his last ounce of strength. He lunged forward and sank his teeth deep into the jaguar's hind leg, holding on with the last of his life's loyalty. The jaguar roared in pain and surprise, twisting to get at the small dog latched onto its leg. That single, selfless act of defiance was the only opening Sam would get. He didn't aim. He didn't think. He brought the barrel of the shotgun up and fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The kickback sent him staggering backward. The Jaguar flinched violently as the buckshot tore into its shoulder and neck. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was a painful, shocking one. The great cat stumbled, its roar turning into a choked cough. It looked at Sam, then at the dog still clamped to its leg, and then at the shattered window. The fight, the unexpected resistance, had cost it too much. With a final snarling grunt, it shook Buster loose, leaped with surprising agility back through the broken window, and vanished into the night. Silence descended upon the cabin, a silence more profound and terrible than any that had come before. It was thick with the smell of gunpowder, animal musk, and blood. The only sound was Sam's own ragged breathing, each inhale a painful, shuddering gasp. The adrenaline drained away, leaving him weak and trembling, his body slick with a cold sweat. His house was a wreck. The table was overturned, his chair was in pieces, and shards of glass littered the floor like cruel diamonds. But his eyes were fixed on the small, still form near the fireplace. "Buster," he whispered, his voice a broken croak. He knelt beside his friend. The dog's chest was rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. His eyes were open, glazed with pain, but they were focused on Sam. Sam gently placed a hand on Buster's head, stroking the matted fur. "You did it, boy," Sam choked out, tears finally breaking free and streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You saved me. You saved me, you stubborn old mutt." Buster managed a faint thump of his tail against the floorboards, a final fleeting message. He let out a soft sigh, a gentle release of breath, and then his eyes lost their focus. The slow, steady rhythm of his breathing simply stopped. The sun that rose that morning was a merciless witness. It illuminated the destruction inside the cabin and the profound emptiness that now filled it. Sam sat on his porch, the shotgun resting against the rail, his gaze lost in the tree line. He hadn't slept. He had spent the remaining hours of darkness sitting beside Buster's body, a silent, heartbreaking vigil. He found the trail of blood easily, big, dark splotches leading from his window back towards the dense woods. The Jaguar was wounded, perhaps mortally. It would not be back. He had won the battle for his home, but the victory felt like ashes in his mouth. He had survived, but at a cost that felt unbearable. Later that day, with aching muscles and a heavier heart, he carried Buster's small, blanket-wrapped body down to the riverbank. He buried him under the shade of a great sycamore tree, the spot where Buster loved to lie on hot summer afternoons, watching the water flow by. He didn't use a shovel. He dug with his bare, gnarled hands, needing to feel the earth, to connect with the raw finality of the act. He didn't make a cross. He placed a single, smooth, white river stone on the mound of fresh soil, a silent, stoic memorial for a silent, stoic friend. He stood there for a long time, watching the river, his only remaining companion. The forest across the water was just as beautiful, just as green, just as alive as it had been 2 days ago. But for Sam, it had changed forever. It was no longer just a place of peace and solitude. It was a place of power, of brutal and unforgiving laws. He had faced the phantom of the river, the true heart of the wild, and had been reminded of his own fragile place within it. There are no villains in the wilderness, he thought, only hunger and life, and the terrible, beautiful fight for one more day. His survival had been bought with a currency of love and loyalty he could never repay, and he knew, as he turned to walk back to his now silent, empty cabin, that he would carry the weight of that debt for the rest of his days.